Hi, everyone. It's great to see you here. I see we have a lot of people joined already. This is a great event for us. We are welcoming Karl Wiegers to the Ukrainian community. Hello, Karl.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation to join you.
Okay, and before Karl will talk about essential requirements practices, I will tell you all how this came to be and who are those volunteers and people help this event and help organize this event. So let me share my screen and show a couple of slides. This will take just a couple of minutes, not more. Okay, so I have a quick presentation for you here. First of all, about sponsors of this event. As you can see, there are no corporations sponsoring this event at all. It's all being sponsored by you, business analysis community in Ukraine and in Europe and in overall in this world. Thank you very much for that. We are really grateful for you, for all of your donations. And just being clear here, this is an official disclaimer. No volunteers, no organizations here, no media partners took any monetary incentives for this event. All the money went directly to the foundation. And this foundation helps orphans, war orphans, child and kids suffering from, well, horrible events, war and flood. As you know, flooding happened a few days ago. So we're really thankful Ukraine Volley Foundation for all what they're doing, for their capabilities of helping children on the ground, educating them, providing them relief efforts and means. And now a few quick words about our media partners, because all of them are also volunteers and they helped bring this event to life. International Institute of Business Analysis, Ukraine chapter. You know this organization very well. Ukraine chapter is a non-profit professional association in Ukraine serving the growing local business analysis community. It represents the IABA, the premier worldwide professional association for business analysts. And I also want to thank Ukraine chapter for this Zoom call. This is what they provided. The next is Passionate BA blog, passionate business analyst, articles, webinars, digest, and more, created with mission to share the passion for business analysis with BAs around the globe. Projector mentioned a mentorship platform is a mentorship platform where you can get personal consultation and advice from top industry experts and accelerate the achievements of your career goal. IT Network is a community of more than 14,000 IT experts from Ukraine who come together to put IT events and conferences. During the war, the IT Volunteer Fund was set up by IT Network to help Ukrainian Army and veterans. Art of Business Analysis is an endorsed education provider of IABA. We have been teaching business and data analysts for over 10 years. Our target audience is middle senior business analysts and product owners. Beetroot Academy, since 2015, more than 10,000 graduates across Ukraine have trusted Swedish-Ukrainian IT school of Beetroot Academy. Our students know the friendly atmosphere of the school and say that everyone can start their IT career here. We are supported by thousands of international partners. E5 Consulting Company encourages sustainable self-improvement and professional growth. Nowadays, E5 offers agile coaching, agile transformation, and training services. Actually, all of these media partners are involved in business analysis community in Ukraine, and we've gathered all of them. So this is a great gathering for us. Business analysis community of EPAM unites over 2,000 business analysts from Kyiv, Ukraine, and other locations. We were established in 2012, and from last year, we are active contributors to Ukrainian BA translated engagement. They're translating the materials from IABA. BA in UA, the only source of Ukrainian content out there, exclusive latest news, articles, and blog posts about business analysts in Ukrainian language. FW Days, the biggest tech conferences in Ukraine, share ideas, broaden experience. Laba International Business School, the global business school that fuels student excellence worldwide, with leading experts in student community larger than Wembley Stadium. Laba prospers professional success. IMPM is an international school of non-technical IT education. They have been making IT understandable for beginners and experienced specialists for over 6 years and have already graduated more than 27,000 students. And the last one, but not least, Lamp of IT is an exceptional community of IT enthusiasts dedicated to providing assistance in the fields of project management, product management, and business analysis. Here you can discover insightful answers from esteemed mentors and experienced IT professionals. Okay, I'm stopping my share, and now I'm passing my word to Taras. Taras is president of PMI Ukraine. This is an event organized by PMI Ukraine with the help of all of these esteemed business analysis organizations. Welcome, Taras.
Hi, everyone. Taras is here. Yeah, I'm really excited to welcome you all to this event for several reasons. The first one is that indeed PMI Ukraine's vision is to create the expert environment for all professionals who seek best practices in managing projects, teams, products. And I'm extremely thankful for the group of volunteers who organized this event and brought Karl to our stage. And of course, I'm super happy to hear firsthand from Karl. I won't even start on how many I learned from his books throughout my career, both in business analysis and project management. One of my favorite books all time is Practical Project Initiation book, which I consider extremely helpful for all people involved in project management. So with all this being said, enjoy your time. Take this chance to ask Karl whatever you are interested in. So yeah, let's have a good time. Karl, yeah, I believe that I will return the microphone to Rost first because he is facilitating this. But yeah, Karl, my sincere appreciation of your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taras.
Thank you, Taras. I want to say a few last words before the Karl starts. Special thank you to Alexander and Mikita, our web developers, who are also volunteers, and they made this website happen really fast, and you all enjoyed it. So if you want to know more about them and about our media partners, just go to our website and click on respective icons. All the links to Alexander and Mikita LinkedIn at below. Also, I want to ask you to continue donating. If you want to win the book with the signature of Karl himself, every single dollar that you will donate, over $35, will count towards your chances to win this book. So continue donating right now through the same links on our website, and we will calculate the final score and select the random winners this Monday. Also, the recording of this event will be published on our YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone. And now to the star of our event, Karl Wiegers himself.
Well, thank you very much for those kind comments, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I'm especially delighted to be able to help contribute to this very worthy charity. And I hope we raise a lot of money for them. And I'm very proud to stand with Ukraine. So I am going to share my screen now. And if I can make that work. So if all went well, you can all see my slides here. I have been interested in how software teams can improve the ways they develop and manage their requirements for a long time. When I was a software developer around 1985, my team came up with the product champion model for working with customer representatives. We started prototyping. We adopted a template for a software requirement specification. We started drawing analysis models and so forth. And we found all of these activities were helpful for us. This interest eventually led me to writing several books on requirements and doing a lot of training and consulting in this area. Excuse me. And one of the interesting things about being a trainer and consultant is you get to look over a lot of people's shoulders and see what they're doing. And I could observe patterns of approaches that worked well and patterns that did not work very well. Now, the third edition of my book titled Software Requirements was pretty big, about 650 pages. There's a lot of stuff in there. But it turns out that busy business analysts, product owners, and product managers don't always have the time to read a really big book. But I realized that I could distill down the dozens of requirements practices from that book into a core set of 20 practices that I think every project team should perform. So Candace Hokanson and I wrote this much shorter book, Software Requirements Essentials, which was published recently. And I just happen to have a copy. And as you can see, this is a fairly thin book, but it has a lot of information in it. One of the things that's important is that these practices apply regardless of the kind of product you're building or the team's development lifecycle. In fact, Candace has a lot of experience with agile teams. And so we made sure that the practices we included and the way we presented them would apply to basically any kind of thing you're working on. Today, I want to tell you about those core practices that are essential to BA success. As we go along, think about the extent to which each of these practices would apply to your situation and look for ways you could use them to improve your requirements or to reduce project risk. Let me point out also at the bottom right here on the screen, the website for this book, softwarerex.com. I'll be referring to that once in a while as we go along. There you can read reviews of the book, you can see some videos and download many useful checklists, templates, and spreadsheet tools. And I just recently launched a 1-minute analyst video series. Each week I am posting a short video to talk about one of these 20 practices, and that's available on my YouTube channel. So I am going to turn off my camera here just so I am not a distraction as we go along. And let me tell you what we're going to talk about today. The 20 practices are grouped into 6 categories. First are 5 practices that lay a solid foundation for project success, and I suspect that sometimes people forget to do some of these. The other practices are grouped into the 5 subdivisions of requirements engineering. There are 4 core practices on requirements elicitation, followed by 4 more on requirements analysis, another 4 on specification, 1 on validating requirements, and finally 2 critical requirements management practices. Of course, these are by no means the only techniques that a skilled BA should have in their toolkit. There are many big books on requirements and business analysis, and they describe dozens of additional practices. These are all valuable in various situations, but I believe that these 20 are the most important ones. In this short presentation, I'm not going to describe each of these practices in detail. I will show you all of the practices in each category, and then I'll drill down into one in each category. Now, when I say the word requirements here, I'm referring to whatever kind of objects your project uses to represent information about stakeholder needs and to describe the solution's capabilities and characteristics. These kinds of knowledge encompass lots of things: business requirements, user requirements, both functional, non-functional, and data solution requirements, use cases or user stories, features, or whatever you use on your project. So even if you don't talk about requirements, you're still using this kind of information. So just do that mental translation. Every project has requirements, whether they're stated or not, whether they're carefully considered or not, whether they're documented in some form or not. And a good set of requirements lets you answer some important and universal questions like these. Everybody should know why we are working on this project. You might want to know what we're trying to build and who we're trying to satisfy. What do we implement first? What do we work on after that? And what do we maybe never get done? And that's okay. How can we tell if our solution is good enough? And everybody is going to be interested in knowing how to know when we're done. It's hard for me to think of any project or team or group of stakeholders that would not find the answers to these questions helpful. So if someone asked you these questions about your project, would you be able to give good answers? I hope so, but if not, you might want to think about that. There are several actions you can take early in an initiative to get the information that lets you answer these kinds of questions. That understanding helps the team lay the foundation for a successful project. It ensures that they address the right problem. It aligns everyone toward common objectives. It makes sure they engage the right participants, and hopefully it keeps the team's efforts all focused in the same direction. These are the 5 practices we recommend to help all projects lay that solid foundation for success. Have you ever seen a project that built and delivered a solution only to discover that they were solving the wrong problem? We should understand the problem before converging on a solution. Organizations launch initiatives to solve a business problem or to exploit a business opportunity. However, sometimes those problems or opportunities are not explicitly stated or documented. It's a good idea not to presume that either a presented problem or a presented solution is necessarily correct. Instead, do some root cause analysis to make sure the problem is well understood and that any proposed solution makes sense. The stakeholders need to understand why this initiative is being launched and its business objectives. I'll talk more about this shortly. When you launch a new initiative, you might not know where to draw the line between what the solution should and should not include. So an important foundational practice is to establish that what's in, what's out boundary. It's a solution scoping action. Every project has stakeholders who are individuals or groups who are either actively involved in a project, are affected by it, or can influence its direction. You need to cast a large net to identify many potential stakeholders. Then you can decide who can best represent the needs of each stakeholder group and decide how the team will engage with them. Every project faces many requirements-related decisions. These include things like resolving conflicts, both within and across user classes, prioritizing requirements, evaluating proposed requirement changes, and then reprioritizing, and more. It's important to determine who the decision makers will be for each of these requirements issues, and preferably do that before the group confronts their first significant decision. Each group also needs to choose a decision rule to apply when resolving issues. So now let's take a closer look at practice number 2, define business objectives. Understanding the business problem or opportunity is an essential first step toward both product and project success. The next step is to describe exactly what the project sponsor or other important stakeholders expect the solution to accomplish, their business objectives. Business objectives could be financial or non-financial. They could be internal, like operations, or outward facing, like products. They could be strategic or tactical. We should also define some success metrics so you can tell if you've achieved or if you're on the path to achieving those objectives. These kinds of business-oriented requirements will lead you to defining a solution concept that you're confident will satisfy them, along with the scope and limitations that bound the solution. I saw a company once doing a very nice job of defining the limitations. This company was building a website for the national sports team for their country, and they had made a list of the scope stuff that they were going to do, but they also made a very nice list of limitations and exclusions. These were things that someone might expect they'd be able to do at this website, but they weren't going to be part of the solution. So having that list of exclusions is a kind of expectation management. And all of this ultimately lets the team elicit the detailed requirements that will describe the solution's capabilities and characteristics. A clear set of business objectives helps the team identify its key stakeholders, who can then work with the BA to understand their needs and define the necessary solution functionality. Decision makers can set the priorities of individual requirements, and they can define the contents of each development increment or product release to align with achieving the most important and most timely business objectives. So I think this is really important. The business objectives will let you determine when the business problem is solved, or the need is fulfilled, or the opportunity is exploited. Now, it's easier to state vague goals, but try to write your objectives to be specific, quantitative, and measurable, because otherwise you can't tell if you've achieved them. A business objectives model is a valuable tool for doing a thorough analysis for complex problems in which multiple business problems and business objectives are intertwined. The business objectives model visually links problems to objectives, to their success metrics, and to the resultant solution concept. Here's a partial example for a proposed restaurant online ordering system. Here's our first business problem. The revenue from our target market for this restaurant, which is 18 to 35 years old, is low. Okay, if that's our problem, what do we hope to accomplish? So our first business objective is to increase the monthly revenue from the target market to a particular amount. As we think through the restaurant's business situation, we uncover additional problems and their corresponding business objectives. And you see all of these have numbers in them. I think it's a very good idea to try to quantify what you're trying to do and what your current problems are, so that you can measure your progress toward achieving your desired outcomes. Our analysis will lead us to conceive a solution that we believe would address those problems and hopefully achieve our desired business outcomes. And the arrows show how you can tie specific major solution features back to individual business objectives. In fact, if you have features that don't tie back to some objective, you might wonder why you're building that feature. I think this sort of analysis is much better than thinking of a cool looking solution first and just hoping it will give you the business outcomes you desire. Well, the first step in dealing with requirements is to get some. People often speak of gathering requirements, but it's not just a simple collection process. I try not to use that term, gathering requirements. A better term for this activity is requirements elicitation. Elicitation does include collection, of course, but it also involves exploring, discovering, and even inventing requirements. Requirements can come from many sources. The BA needs to look for requirements from various user representatives, subject matter experts, and other stakeholders. You might have documentation about your business processes that you're automating any current systems or competing products. There might be applicable laws and business policies, user problem reports, and many other places where you might find important information. So there are a lot of ways to look for requirements also, and the skilled BA has many elicitation techniques in their toolkit. These include very commonly interviews. You might hold facilitated group workshops. You can learn a lot by observing users at work. You could use surveys or questionnaires, process modeling, and many other techniques. So the BA needs to build a toolkit that gives them a lot of different ways to deal with the various kinds of situations they encounter. So here are 4 core requirements elicitation practices. On the next slide, we'll discuss understanding what users need to do with the solution. This is really important. My last book was called Software Development Pearls, and it's got descriptions of 60 lessons I've learned in my rather long career in software development. And somebody asked me once, well, what's the most important lesson you've learned? And I think this is it. Understanding what users need to do with the solution is central to success. So we're going to spend a little time on that here. All systems react to various kinds of events that trigger some response. There could be business events that launch a use case, signal events like inputs from a switch or a sensor or an incoming message. There could be temporal or time-triggered events that lead to some system behavior. So that's another useful technique for many kinds of applications, and especially for applications or middleware, for example, devices that don't involve a lot of user interaction, but still do a lot of things. All software systems process data, so you must assess data concepts and their relationships. Data modeling is a powerful technique for this purpose. And besides functionality, which we very naturally focus on, for every product, you need to explore quality attributes. These are a category of non-functional requirements. There are often trade-offs between these quality characteristics such that you cannot optimize all of them at once. And that means during requirements development, you need to explore those so that you can give designers the information that lets them make appropriate trade-off decisions. Well, if you were holding a requirements elicitation discussion with some users, like the new user shown here, about some information system, which of these questions do you think would yield the greatest insights? Should we ask, what do you want? Or maybe, what are your requirements? How about, what do you want the system to do? Or what features would you like to see in the system? But I think a better question is to ask, what do you need to do with the solution? That shifts the discussion from a focus on the product to a focus on users, and more specifically on usage. People often talk about user-centric, design or development, but I think it's more appropriate to say usage-centric. That's really the key here. If you focus on features during elicitation, that can lead the team to implement incomplete functionality that doesn't let users do all the things they have to do. The IIBA talks about stakeholder requirements. It's the middle level of their three-level model of different kinds of requirements. Well, I developed a three-level model very much like that quite a few years before the IIBA existed. But my second level is user requirements. I don't really like the term stakeholder requirements because, as far as I can tell, all requirements come from some stakeholder. Here, we are talking specifically about requirements from that subset of stakeholders who will actually use the solution in some way. We want to make sure our user requirements align with achieving the project's business objectives. Of course, this implies that you need to define the business objectives first, as we saw a few minutes ago. When you're talking about system behaviors, people naturally focus on describing the way the system's going to function when all goes well, something sometimes called the happy path. But in addition to exploring these normal success scenarios, you also need to consider alternative ways the user might accomplish a task, as well as exceptions that might prevent successful completion. So from the user requirements, the BA can then identify the necessary functionality the system must include to let users get the job done. Also, maybe you've had this problem sometime. People told you they needed certain functionality, so you built it, or it just seemed like a good idea, and nobody ever used it. Well, by making sure that the specified functionality aligns with known user tasks, you're less likely to waste time and effort implementing that kind of functionality that goes unused. It's a frustrating experience. That's happened to me. And you work hard in making that functionality as good as the other stuff you do, but if people don't use it, it's kind of wasted effort. Two commonly used techniques for exploring user requirements are use cases and user stories. It can be a little challenging to steer elicitation participants from thinking about product features to focusing on usage. I find that use cases provide a nicely structured way to facilitate that change in the thought process. The name of a use case defines the goal the user is trying to accomplish. Now, as an example, maybe someone who posts articles on a publication platform wants to view article statistics. I do that. I have nearly 100 articles posted on my medium.com account. And I check the statistics because I want to, understand what people are reading. So that becomes a use case name, view article statistics. If you ever hear an elicitation participant say, I want to do something, or I need to be able to do something, that do something likely is a use case. A use case template contains categories so you can fully describe the use case. That might include preconditions that must be satisfied before the system can execute the use case, post conditions that are true after successful completion, the steps that take place in a dialogue between the user and the system, how to handle things that can go wrong, pertinent business rules, and other information. The BA can then derive all the necessary functional requirements that developers must implement to realize the use case. You don't implement business requirements. You don't implement user requirements. Software developers implement functionality. And so that's ultimately what we need to understand. And I also realized when I began employing use cases that testers can create tests from the use case specification as well. This is a really powerful quality aid, and we're going to come back to testing later on. User stories are typically employed on Agile projects as the primary requirements deliverable. A user story is written according to a pattern that provides a little more information and context than the use case, including the type of user and the motivation or rationale behind the request. So for this same need, we might say, as an author, I want to view the statistics for my articles so that I can see which topics my readers enjoy the most. So this is a little more informative. Rather than writing detailed functional requirements, Agile projects typically provide the story details through a set of acceptance criteria the implemented story must satisfy. Requirements and tests are complementary thought processes. They show the same information in different ways. I don't like the phrase Agile requirements because it implies that somehow the requirements for an Agile project are qualitatively different from those on other projects, and that's just simply not true. Developers need the same information to build the right software correctly. Now, you can write that information or communicate it in a variety of ways. Functional requirements are one way, acceptance tests are another way, but it's the same information. They need the same knowledge. So there's no such thing as Agile requirements in my view. Now, with both use cases and user stories, the important point is to keep the focus on understanding user goals, not on describing system functionality. Well, once you've elicited some requirements, you need to analyze them. But what exactly does it mean to analyze requirements? Analysis sounds like something that just kind of happens through staring at requirements long enough. In reality, you can use several techniques to search for specific problems and produce better requirements and hence better solutions. Analyzing requirements is where a skilled BA really adds value. Analysis is an incremental and iterative process. It's woven together with the ongoing requirements elicitation, specification, and validation activities. Ultimately, though, requirements analysis involves ensuring that the needs of all the stakeholders are understood and documented appropriately, whatever's appropriate for your environment. And the outcome of successful analysis ensures that we could define, agree upon, build, and test a satisfactory solution that would meet those needs. Analysis involves multiple thought processes to try to make sure you understand what each requirement is saying. Analysis also involves detailing requirements to an appropriate level. You can compare different representations of information to spot errors and fill in gaps in your knowledge. And along the way here, you confirm and refine your knowledge. There are 4 essential requirements analysis practices. First is simply to analyze both individual requirements and sets of requirements. I'll discuss this further in a moment. This is one of my favorite practices. Drawing visual diagrams or models of requirements is an especially powerful technique. I've been a fan of requirements modeling for many years. I took a class on structured analysis and design around 1986, and it totally changed my thinking about how to approach software development. I had never thought about drawing pictures that represented your problem or domain or your solution ideas before you actually started writing code. But it's a lot faster and cheaper to iterate on models and diagrams than it is on code. So I'm a big fan of requirements modeling. People often create prototypes, possible or preliminary or partial implementations to better understand the problem and to refine and validate requirements for some part of the solution. Since no team can implement all of its requirements simultaneously, they must prioritize them to make sure the team delivers the most important capabilities in the right sequence to maximize the delivered value. So here are the major aspects of analyzing individual requirements. You should be able to trace each requirement or user story back to its origin. That could be a stakeholder request, a policy, a quality attribute, or some other source that led to including it. If anyone asks why a particular requirement is present, the BA should have a good answer. A big aspect of analysis is to decompose large or high-level requirements into a suitable level of detail, whatever will make sure that everybody understands it and can build and test it. Analysis also includes deriving functional requirements from the various parts of a use case, a story, business rules, or other sources. People who have done development know that they write a lot of code to handle exceptions that could prevent successful execution. So during analysis, we need to identify potential error conditions that the system must be able to detect and handle. These could be user actions, system conditions, or data values that all have the potential of making the solution not do what it's supposed to do. Experienced BAs automatically scan for certain characteristics as they review requirements. They should be correct, complete, feasible, necessary, unambiguous, and so forth. We've all seen those lists. You're never going to get perfect requirements, but if you keep those characteristics in mind as you write and review them, you will get better requirements. You should consider how someone could judge whether the requirement was correctly implemented and ready for use. That's its acceptance criteria. People often make unstated assumptions regarding requirements. Conflicting and obsolete assumptions can cause problems later on. Constraints restrict the developer's design or implementation options, hopefully for some good reason. So as an analyst, confirm whether any constraints that you see embedded in the requirements are truly restrictions or they're just solution ideas that someone proposed. Business rules often influence or serve as the source of specific pieces of functionality or data. It's important to know which rules apply to which processes, which rules apply to certain functions and data objects. We'll come back to business rules later on. Products that pose safety risks must include hazard analysis as part of their requirements analysis. And think about the risks that any requirement could pose to the project's success, whether we included it or if we decided not to include it. Finally, requirements reuse involves both crafting requirements that can be reused in other contexts and finding existing functionality that your application could exploit. So consider both of those reuse aspects during analysis. Now, other aspects of analysis assess sets of requirements. It's hard to see the requirements that aren't there. They're invisible. Finding missing requirements involves reading between the lines. To assess completeness, trace downward from business objectives through to solution requirements to ensure that everything aligns properly. Inconsistencies can arise between a parent requirement and its children, and requirements of the same type can also conflict. One might say to do A, another says to do B, but it's logically impossible to do both. Watch out for multiple instances of the same information. I once reviewed several use cases that had nearly, but not exactly, the same data structure definition in 3 places. They were all a little bit different. And when that happens, the reader doesn't know which one to believe, if any. They could all be wrong. Replication also raises the risk of generating an inconsistency if one instance is changed, but others are not. It's better to point to a single source of the information instead of duplicating it whenever you can do that. Some requirements depend on others being implemented at the same time or previously. For example, it only makes sense to implement exception handling code concurrently with the functionality where the error could occur. So beyond those desirable characteristics of being complete and consistent, make sure that groups of requirements are written in a way and labeled to be modifiable and traceable. Creating multiple representations of requirements using different thought processes lets you compare them to find problems. This is, I think, a really powerful technique that I discovered a long time ago. If you represent knowledge only in one form, and it doesn't matter what form that is, it could be functional requirements or a picture or tests or whatever, but if you represent that information in only one form, you must believe it. You have no choice. But if you can represent the knowledge in different forms, for example, details in text and then a higher level of abstraction with a picture, and then if you can compare those, then a lot of times you'll find disconnects between them that show that you have some problems. Earlier, I mentioned the importance of prioritizing requirements. And stakeholders sometimes assume that the solution will include certain functionality without them having to say so. But I don't think telepathy and clairvoyance are very effective requirements elicitation tools. We can't predict the future and we can't read people's minds. Just yesterday, I gave this presentation and somebody described a case where they had exactly this problem. They had built a particular functionality, a particular report generation that was similar to some that had been done before, and they didn't include something that the users assumed would be present but didn't request. So now the users are unhappy and the developers are saying, well, yeah, we can add this, but it's going to cost you more because you didn't ask for it, so we didn't plan for it. So those are very unpleasant conversations to have. Now, these analysis techniques will all become second nature to you as you get into the habit of applying them. But until you get into that habit and internalize these, it's helpful to have checklists. So if you go to the softwarereqs.com website for the book, you can download these checklists for these different analysis techniques, as well as many other checklists. So moving on down to our next subdomain, requirement specification. The term requirement specification refers both to the recording of requirements knowledge and to the deliverables you produce, such as a software requirement specification. Here's something I want you to do. Whenever you see the word or the phrase writing requirements, please mentally change that to say representing requirements knowledge. When we talk about writing requirements, we think of natural language text. And that's the most popular way to record software requirements because it's how people normally communicate. However, there are many alternatives, including tables, visual models, tests, screen designs, prototypes, mathematical expressions, and so forth. Now, some people don't like to write requirements, but I believe that the cost of recording knowledge is small compared to the cost of acquiring that knowledge, or perhaps reacquiring it in the future. Human memories are imperfect, they're incomplete. They fade and distort over time, and other people can't access our memories. So documented requirements constitute a form of a persistent group memory. Requirements can be stored in many structures, including databases, spreadsheets, documents, a requirements management tool, sticky notes on a wall, whatever works for you. I tend to talk about documents, but really that's just a container. So these can vary in the information they contain, how that information is organized, how much detail is included, and so forth. So think of your requirement spec simply as being a container for certain kinds of requirements related knowledge, no matter its form. Very important point here is to remember that the goal of writing any kinds of requirements is always clear and effective communication. It's not conformance to any specific style rigidly. It's not to avoid violating whatever the current fashion is for how we do this or anything else. The goal is clear and effective communication, and there are many ways to achieve that. Two core requirement specification practices are to write the various kinds of requirements in consistent ways according to recognizable patterns, and to organize that information in a structured fashion with the help of a template. I'm going to talk in a moment about the importance of identifying and documenting business rules. And a common vocabulary helps the participants avoid misunderstandings. Therefore, each project should accumulate a glossary of significant terms, abbreviations, acronyms, and synonyms to make sure that everyone understands them in the same way. Let me give you an example of a business rule. My friend Jeremy visited his local blood bank's website and made an appointment to donate blood later that same day. Good for Jeremy. However, when Jeremy arrived at the blood bank later that day, the staff told him that they didn't take any same-day appointments, even though the website let him make that same-day appointment. He was annoyed. Business rules are statements that define or restrict certain aspects of an organization's operations, or they influence the behaviors of people and systems within the organization. They're not software requirements in themselves, but business rules often lead to derived requirements to enforce or comply with the rule. And as such, they're a critical piece of the requirements puzzle on every project. The blood bank's website made a mistake on that issue by not enforcing the no same-day appointment policy. There are several types of business rules. Some simply state facts about the business. Many rules impose constraints on who can do what under what conditions. Action enablers trigger some system or business behavior, and computations describe how certain calculations are performed. Business rules come from various sources. Company policies constitute a large source, like a store's policies for issuing refunds. Many systems must comply with various laws and regulations, and industry standards, like interface standards, are another major source. Too often, though, business rules are not documented at all, or they're embedded in the code. It's better to document business rules like you document requirements. They should be clear, complete, consistent, unambiguous, and so forth. Business rules are also subject to the same problems that can afflict requirements. One rule could conflict or overlap with another. A rule might be obsolete or based on assumptions that are no longer valid. Rules could be imprecise or fail to cover certain conditions. And as with requirements, textual rules aren't always the best way to communicate that information. Suppose you have an online store that offers various combinations of discounts and free shipping depending on the total price of an order and whether the customer is a club member. You could write out all those rules in natural language, but displaying them in the form of a decision table like this is easier to understand. The decision table shows all the possible combinations of conditions and the resulting actions. Here there are two sets of conditions that we see. One depends on the order amount, and the other depends on whether the customer is a club member. There are various values for those that lead to multiple possible actions. We show the actions down below here. So as an example, let's look at rule discount 5. Let's give these things names. And that says that if the order total is in the range of $50 to $100 inclusive, and the customer is a club member, then the X's tell us what happens. They get a 10% discount and they get free shipping on their order. So representing business logic with decision tables helps to avoid boundary value problems. Like you might have a rule that says, well, if it's less than 50, this happens. If it's more than 50, that happens. Well, what about exactly 50? Actually, I had a book publishing contract once that had exactly that error. And just by coincidence, the number involved was 50. Exactly what happened at 50 was not defined. So the table makes it clear that this is less than 50, in the range 50 to 100, and greater than 100. You can avoid boundary value problems, and this helps you avoid missing logical combinations. This table format is compact, so it's easier to create, to read, and to modify than if you have this long repetitive set of very similar rules. And a decision table also facilitates test design to ensure that no condition combinations are missed. So I really like these kinds of simple tools. They're just very convenient ways to represent knowledge. We're still writing requirements, or in this case, business rules. We're just doing it visually rather than in text. So by this point in the requirements development process, you understand the project's business objectives. You've elicited requirements for some portion of the solution from various stakeholders. You've analyzed them and recorded those requirements in appropriate forms. So the team is now ready to begin development on that portion of the product, right? Maybe. Yes, you have some requirements, but how do you know they're the right requirements? Are you confident they'll meet the user's goal and address the business situation that led to launching the initiative in the first place? You could have a set of beautifully written and modeled requirements that appear to be crystal clear, complete, and unambiguous, and yet they could still be wrong. Requirements validation activities strive to confirm that some set of requirements accurately describes stakeholder needs, and to confirm that a solution based on those requirements would indeed satisfy those needs and achieve the intended business objectives. The terms verification and validation are often confused or misused. Verification confirms that whatever you've done was done correctly and to specification. Validation ensures that you're doing the right thing. Again, as with analysis, requirements validation activities are interwoven with the other things you do around requirements, elicitation, analysis, and specification. Prototypes and early releases of your solution, or even delivering the full solution, those are all ways to validate with customers whether or not you're building the correct solution. But those can be rather expensive activities, and you don't get much feedback until you've actually built something. So a core practice for ongoing requirements validation involves a combination of reviewing requirements and testing them before you have any code. Peer review of documented requirements is a powerful quality practice. I've been a fan of peer reviews for a long time. In a peer review, colleagues of the person who created some requirements artifact examine it for potential defects and other issues. Reviews are a high leverage investment in software quality, and requirements reviews offer the highest leverage of all. I am so enthusiastic about reviews that I wrote a book about it called Peer Reviews in Software quite a few years ago. And it's also an indication of an organization's culture. In a peer review culture, people are willing to invite their colleagues to look over their work and tell them what they've done wrong and what they can do better. I would not even consider working in an organization where reviews were not just a basic part of the culture. I think it's that important. Well, to be successful, there are some things we need to do. We need to choose the right review participants. One category is people who were like the author who created it and similar workers. A BA might invite another analyst to review their requirements because the other BA knows what kind of requirements problems to look for. However, that other BA can't tell if the requirements properly address the business need. They just see what they get. And I've encountered this myself. I've reviewed many, many requirements documents for clients as a consultant, but I don't get the original, why are we working on this project? What are we trying to accomplish? So I can't tell if they're the right requirements. I can't really validate them, but I can find a lot of other kinds of problems. So to validate the requirements, you also need reviewers who supplied the information that led to those requirements, such as representatives of various user classes, maybe marketing staff for a commercial product, and the author of any higher level or predecessor system specification if one exists. Also, people who must base their work on the requirements. I call them victims of the requirements. They also make good reviewers. Architects, designers, data analysts, developers, testers, they will all find different kinds of issues from their point of view. We need to choose the appropriate type of review, and there are several forms of reviews that span a range of formality and rigor. The simplest involves just asking a colleague to look over something you've created. That's an ad hoc review. You just ask for a little help from one of your friends. In a pass around, you invite several people to examine some requirements or diagrams that you want some feedback on. A team review and an inspection are more structured and more formal, which makes them slower and more expensive, but also more thorough and more valuable. So I would use the more formal types of reviews for higher risk portions of the requirements. Reviewers can use a checklist to remind them of common types of requirements problems to look for, like the usual things we see: ambiguities, inconsistencies, missing things, and so forth. With experience, you'll internalize this list and you'll just know what to look for. In the meantime, though, having the checklist as a reminder is helpful. And you can download a requirements review checklist from softwarerex.com also. Testing the requirements is maybe not obvious to people, but I learned a long time ago that you can begin testing your software as soon as you define your first requirement. That truth was an eye-opener for me when I first realized it. Requirements describe what to build and how the solution should behave in various conditions. Tests describe how to tell if the solution is exhibiting the correct behavior and to find situations where it does not. Long ago, I discovered that writing tests from my mental image of how the system should behave is a different thought process than writing requirements. So after I would write the tests, then I would walk through them against the requirements to make sure that every test could be performed or executed by firing off certain requirements. Every time I did that comparison, I found errors. I found missing or erroneous requirements. I found missing or erroneous tests. It's even better if you can use two different brains in two different people, unless you happen to have two brains yourself, to write the requirements and the tests starting from the same information source. So if you're taking the use case approach, you might have a BA write detailed functional requirements for the use case, and you might have a tester write tests from the use case, and now you have things that you can compare. That's a good way to discover ambiguities and gaps. Agile teams often write acceptance criteria in the form of acceptance tests to define a user story's details. Those tests help developers understand what to develop, what to implement, and how to tell if they're done. The tests also help users envision whether a story will meet their needs, which is, after all, the essence of requirements validation. A popular way to write acceptance tests uses the given, when, then pattern. Think back to the user story we saw earlier. As an author, I want to view the statistics for my articles so that I can see which topics my readers enjoy the most. So here's one possible acceptance test for that story. Again, we'll give it an identifier, AT1. Given that I am logged into the platform and I have articles published, when I request to view statistics, then some things should happen. A graph of total article view statistics from the past 30 days and some details, blah, blah, blah. Whatever should happen. So this is a nice structure for writing these acceptance criteria or acceptance tests. And here's a nice way you can use test thinking to validate your requirements before writing any code. Suppose you've drawn a model to complement some of your textual requirements. You can trace the logical execution path on the model with a highlighter pen as you walk through the tests, and then you can see if the system would behave as you expect. After you go through all the tests with your highlighter, look for some problems. Maybe there's a path in the model that you never highlighted. That could either mean that you're missing a test to cover that path, or it could mean that that path does not reflect a legitimate system behavior. Or if the test has no corresponding path and you can't trace it in the model, either the test is invalid or the model's wrong. Either way, that disconnect tells you there's a problem. Again, if you only created one of those views of the requirements, you have to believe it. Creating more than one view lets you compare them. Here's an example. This is a portion of a process flow diagram for a website that lets a sales representative enter orders for a customer who's on the phone. In one scenario, we've got this question, is the item in stock? And maybe the customer's requested items are all out of stock. Ooh, it's out of stock. Do you want another item? And if so, you keep cycling it around, but there's never anything in there because there's none of their items are in stock. So among many others, the tester has written this test. Given that the cart is empty when you're done with the dialogue, when the customer declines to order more items, then what should happen? The process should terminate. So we try to trace the path that this test describes on the process flow, but you can't do it. We're following this path and it should end the process, but that's not what happens. This says that we should send this final quote to the customer, but there's nothing in the cart, so that doesn't seem to make sense. So that doesn't match the test, and it doesn't match our mental model of how this thing ought to behave. If we assume that the test is correct, now we have found an error in the model and in any textual requirements that align with the model. In this case, we found a missing requirement. So armed with that knowledge about the error in the diagram, the BA redraws this portion of the process model to look like this. Now we have this blue diamond in the modified process that checks to see if the cart contains items following the end of that dialogue between the customer and the sales rep. If so, it sends the quote to the customer. If not, it terminates the process. Let's go back to that same test. Now you can trace the path correctly on the process flow, ending the sales process instead of sending the customer a meaningless quote with nothing in it. So finding errors like this before the team writes the code and before the customer encounters a problem is a good thing. You might have noticed that customers are never in a good mood when they report a problem. So let's try to avoid that. All right, so far I have described 18 practices that can help you develop a set of high quality solution requirements. Once you have those fine requirements in hand, now what happens to them? Requirements management is the subdomain of requirements engineering that deals with how requirements are used on the project and how the project, whoops, sorry, a little quick there, how the project responds to evolving needs. Requirements management involves several ongoing activities. You need to track versions of individual requirements as they change over time, so we always work on the correct version. Similarly, the status of each individual requirement changes over time. Each one goes from being proposed to approved to ultimately being either verified as correctly implemented in the solution or deferred or deleted. If you're serious about requirements management, you'll trace each one both backward to its origin and forward to design elements, code, and tests that show where it was implemented in the solution. See, if I had written a book with 21 most important requirements practices, requirements traceability would have been the one I added, but I decided to stop at 20. You always have to stop somewhere. So these are all valuable techniques, but the two most important requirements management practices that apply to every project are establishing and managing requirements baselines and managing changes to requirements effectively. You need to have mechanisms in place to add new requirements that come along, modify existing ones, and delete planned requirements from your backlog of pending work. So let's take a closer look at number 19 here, establish requirements baselines. As the BA, you've developed a set of requirements and confirmed that they describe a suitable solution. The next step is for the development team to commit to implementing a subset of those requirements in a specific time frame or development cycle. That's all a requirements baseline is. It's an agreement. Establishing a baseline doesn't mean that change won't happen. It probably will. However, the baseline assures everyone involved that the team can move forward with development of that portion of the product at a low risk of major changes. A sensible baselining and change approach ensures that everyone always knows what they should and should not be working on. You can define a baseline in two ways. A time-bound baseline begins by establishing a time box. That could be a single iteration, a group of iterations, a planned release, or even the entire product. The team then allocates requirements from its backlog of pending work to the baseline until the time box's development and testing capacities are filled. In contrast, a scope-bound baseline consists of a logically grouped set of features, requirements, or stories that can be built, tested, and deployed together, and they're approved as a unit. With the scope-bound approach, the requirements baseline is established without necessarily knowing its size or delivery schedule. The baseline serves as the reference point for beginning change control of the committed requirements. Your team should always follow its defined requirements change process to make sure the right people make the right decisions. And here's the part that nobody likes about that, because that might require negotiating changes in scope, time, or resources for the work. Everybody wants to keep putting in more and more functionality, and you'll still be done on time, right? Well, maybe not. To help with this, contingency buffers should be included in your plans to provide some slack time that can accommodate a reasonable amount of change. Otherwise, the first new or changed requirement that comes along, or any other project surprises, can disrupt your plans and commitments, and then people get unhappy. So we've covered a lot of ground quickly here today. I hope that you've made some notes of practices that you feel would add value to your project, maybe reduce risk or increase the chances of success. I cannot promise that if you perform these 20 practices on your projects, you'll definitely be successful, but I can promise that you'll have fewer requirements-related headaches if you do. And that seems to me like a strong enough motivation to look into them and see if these practices can help your teams beef up how they plan, develop, and manage their requirements. So that's my story for today. In fact, let me bring that back. And I'm going to turn my camera back on and we can talk.
Okay. So we have quite a few questions in our Slido webpage.
Mhm.
So I'm going to read them to you.
Okay.
And let's make an interview out of this. Okay, so the first question from Anonymous. What's your approach to gathering requirements in a new and unknown domain? How not to end up in a rabbit hole and focus on the right direction?
You know, this gets to an interesting point. One of the debates around business analysis is, to what extent does the BA, or is it valuable for a BA to have application domain experience? Or could any BA go into any problem and, you know, do a good job? And I think you're better off knowing something about the application domain, because you can ask more insightful questions. You know more of the context and environment. But if you're being asked to develop requirements for some domain that maybe we've never worked in before or you're unfamiliar with, there's several things you have to watch out for. First of all, let's start by understanding our business objectives. I think that's a really good starting point so that we can make sure we have a target in mind and a reference frame. You also need to identify who the key stakeholders are. Who has the information? Who are we trying to satisfy? You know, stakeholders can present requirements, but they can also present constraints. So for example, if you're working in a regulated industry, there are a lot of rules and laws you have to follow, and we need to make sure we do that right. So we need to make sure that we know the right people to talk to. So I would work hard on understanding who our stakeholders are that would have the right information. Sometimes you end up working with someone, it turns out they have a very strong, narrow, biased perspective on the problem, and that's the only input you get. So I think casting a wide net for stakeholders so you understand who your various user classes are and can figure out which of those are more important, that's a pretty good starting point. So that'll help keep you out of the rabbit hole and focus in the right direction if we understand, who the right people are to talk to that have the knowledge and understand the objectives. That's not a perfect solution, but it's a good starting point.
Okay, thank you. And the next question from Maria. What, in your experience, is overlooked the most by business analysts while collecting and managing requirements?
So what is overlooked by BAs? Well, it depends on the BA, of course, but I think there are several risks that the BA has. One is to remember that the BA is not a scribe. We're not just writing down whatever people tell us they want. The BA is leading an exploration. And so they have to ask a lot of questions, and they have to stimulate people's thinking and make sure we get below the surface of what people are requesting. People naturally talk about the things that are most obvious to them, the tasks that they do the most frequently or the features that they would use the most. So I would say focusing on usage, as I've emphasized earlier, rather than on product features, that's a good way to avoid overlooking things. If you just talk about the features, you just write down the features that people want to include, you're going to miss some important things. Again, we're talking about what's overlooked the most. Stakeholders can be overlooked. So look for lots of stakeholders. We have in the book a big table that says, has a list of many possible stakeholders within the development team, inside the developing organization, but outside the team or even outside the developing organization. So I would start with a big list of possible stakeholders and see which ones might apply to you to avoid overlooking one that's important. People naturally focus on everything going well, and so they don't talk about exceptions. They don't talk about things that could go wrong and how the system should handle them. So that's another area that's often overlooked. You need to know about business rules, constraints, and probably the last area that people are most commonly not going to discuss and overlook are quality attribute requirements. We focus on functionality, but we don't necessarily focus on security, usability, reliability, and those kinds of quality characteristics that should be an important part of the discussion. And one final suggestion here, we're not experts in most areas. None of us are. We know a little bit about something that we do, and then there's a lot we know, not much about. And I'm always willing to ask a final question during a requirements discussion, which is there anything we haven't talked about yet? Or is there any question I haven't asked you that I should, but I just don't know to ask? That's called a meta question. It's a question about questions. And sometimes when you do that, people will say, that's an interesting question. We haven't talked about this one thing. It just didn't come up. Oh, good. Let's talk about that. That's a way to avoid overlooking something that you didn't even know to ask about.
I think I have just one thing I haven't asked you yet.
Yeah.
Do you provide personal group trainings?
I just knocked my ear thing out. I have. I've done a great deal of training. So if we can talk about that. We've got, there might be companies that would be interested in these kinds of presentations. One of the things that I'm doing right now with Candace, my co-author, is we are developing a 3 to 4 hour presentation based on the book that does look at all 20 practices, not just the handful that we had time to do today. So yes, I've done a lot of that.
Okay, so I'm actually looking forward to discuss this with you more and find out options for Ukrainians.
Okay.
Okay, and to the next question from Anonymous. What keeps you inspired in your professional practice for such a long time?
What keeps me inspired? Well, I'm actually retired. I've been retired for 15 years. I'm almost 70 years old, so I've been doing this for a long time. But what I find inspiring and motivating is providing materials, even answers to questions like these, that people find useful. It means a lot to me when someone writes and says, oh, this talk was very helpful. I got a lot out of that book, whatever. So that's what you do. I take things I've learned from my experience or from reading or from observing what other people did and, learn from others. So I like the learning. And but I really like sharing knowledge that other people find useful, that makes their life easier, makes their projects more successful. That's really why all authors and trainers do what they do, is they want to help other people do a better job and be more successful with their help.
Well, we are happy that we all are making you inspired today.
Good.
Okay, and the next question, it's more about overview of the past. In your opinion, in last 30 years, how business analysis changed?
How has business analysis changed? Well, it's changed in a lot of ways. In the first place, 30 years ago, almost no one used the term business analysis. It was called systems analysis or requirements analysis. We didn't have business analysts, we had systems analysts and requirements engineers. So the terminology has changed. But the biggest change, of course, in the last, say, 20 years in particular, is the growth and recognition that business analysis is a discipline. It has bodies of knowledge. It has roles and job functions. It plays a certain very important part in projects. It bridges what a lot of different work happens in the projects. You find the business analyst is bridging the information between user communities and technical communities and other areas of knowledge, like people who are aware of regulations and business rules. So I think people have recognized that there's always been this function of exploring requirements, but by making it a profession, by having certifications, bodies of knowledge, training, and so forth, I think it's gained more respect and a better understanding for why that's such an important contributor to project success.
Okay. So next question. Just updating to see the tally. How we can strike the balance between agile principles of responding to change or following a plan and need for a clear, stable requirements in highly dynamic environment. So where this balance should be?
The balance on projects between change versus a plan and clear, stable requirements, and if it's a very dynamic environment. Well,
yeah.
The way that is handled, of course, on agile projects is to carve up your project into smaller chunks and recognize that for each chunk, you have a plan, and for each chunk, you have a process, but for each chunk that you build, you have to have stable requirements for that chunk, whether the chunk represents 2 weeks of work or 4 weeks or whatever size iteration you're working on. The requirements have to be stable for that period of time. Otherwise, you are always churning, always chasing. So I think the real balance is to not do this. Don't say, oh, we are change driven, therefore we'll just build something and then we'll fix it later if we need to. We'll change it later if we need to. That's a very bad idea, in my opinion, because it's expensive. I don't like doing rework. There's always rework in software development. It's the nature of what we do, but we can avoid doing excessive rework, unplanned rework. So don't let the idea that we can make changes later replace thinking about the next piece of work that you're going to do. And if the environment is dynamic, if things are truly changing fast, then let's identify those portions of the solution that we must design to be able to adapt to change. Other portions will probably be more stable, and we can do that more, incrementally and more with more confidence. But too many people, I think, take the agile interpretation to an extreme and say, well, we don't have time to write this down. And I'm thinking, well, the hard part's not writing it down. The hard part's figuring out what it is. So let's not look for those as excuses to not do thinking, not record knowledge for future use, and so forth. But it's always a balancing act, and you have to look at the parts that are truly dynamic versus the parts that we just didn't do a very good job on.
Okay, we have quite a few questions that ask about future of business analysis, and we're not gonna go deep into those. But just let's talk about the present. What do you think is the impact of language models, machine learning, and emerging AI on business analysis and requirement?
I have no opinion on that. I just don't, I have not looked into it. It's not something that I've studied or thought about much, so I don't have any opinion. And I'm glad we're not going to talk about the questions dealing with the future of business analysis or anything, because I have learned that I am not good at predicting the future, and so I do not attempt to predict the future. Sorry, I just don't have anything useful to say about that.
That's okay. Let's go to the next question. What are main soft and technical skills for modern business analysts?
The main soft and technical skills. Well, I'm glad the question was phrased that way, because unlike some other aspects of software development and certain job roles, the business analyst needs both technical and soft skills. We have in my book with Joy Beatty, the third edition of my software requirements book, we have a whole chapter that talks about those kinds of things. So I would refer people to that. But certainly, I would say one of the critical skills is modeling. I think that's an absolutely critical skill, because the BA needs to have in their toolkit many techniques available so that when they encounter a certain situation, they can say, oh, this is the best way to represent that information. I will draw this kind of picture, or I will write text and organize it this way. So the BA needs the soft skills to interact with people, negotiation, questioning, interviewing without, or even challenging, but without being the smarty person who knows it all. But they also need to be able to represent and communicate information in ways that speak both to the technical audience who has to build something and the user audience who has to validate the requirements and understand what they can get. So there's a lot of judgment that goes into being a business analyst, and in terms of thinking about how best to approach a particular problem. Experience is very valuable, but there are some people that we know, why don't you go develop the code? We don't really want you talking to customers. You don't want to talk to customers, and we don't think that's a very good idea anyway. So you go do something else and we'll take care of that. It's a specialized kind of skill. Another interesting aspect of that is that unlike many people in software, BAs come from a different range of backgrounds. Most people don't grow up saying, I want to be a business analyst. Okay. But when they decide to go into that role, they might come from a technical background, in which case maybe they don't know much about how to write requirements. Maybe they come from a business side background, in which case they don't know about how do you communicate to technical people. So I think every BA needs to do an inventory of their personal skills and identify the areas where they need to learn more and get better.
Thank you. Next question. What's your approach to maintaining traceability of requirements through the project lifecycle?
What was the first part of that? So it was about traceability.
Yes, approach to maintaining traceability.
That's an interesting question. The approach to maintaining traceability. Traceability, of course, refers to being able to take a requirement and to be able to show that it is linked to a piece of your design or sections of code into certain tests, and trace it maybe back to a business rule where it came from. So if that rule changes, we know that the requirement might change. Traceability builds a nest of threads that pull these pieces of information together. One thing you have to do is to uniquely label each requirement so that you can refer to it. You cannot have bullet lists in requirements, in my opinion, because there's no way to refer to a bullet. You need a stable way to identify and label pieces of information. So sometimes if you're using like a hierarchical numbering system, 3.2.4, and so forth, if you insert a new requirement, it changes the numbers for everything below that. And then you have a problem with your traceability data. So that's not a good idea. So unique labels, persistent labels on requirements is important. Another thing you need to do is you need to accumulate traceability data as you go along. You cannot get to the end of the project and say, okay, let's build a requirements traceability matrix. Which requirement turns into this piece of code? You can't do that. It's almost impossible. But when you do work, as you create a bit of a design, as you write some code, as you write some tests that connect back to certain requirements, if you record that information then right away in your traceability matrix or your requirements management tool, then it's a very small amount of work to create that and keep it current and complete. But don't try to reconstruct it at the end. That's almost impossible. So those would be a few suggestions. One other tip is that you can do traceability data by hand for a few dozen requirements. More than that, you need a tool. You need a requirements management tool.
Yeah, and let's jump right away to the next question. What are your most useful and beloved tools?
I do not try to stay current on tools because there are hundreds practically of tools out there that people use for requirements purposes, certainly dozens of them. They change all the time. Their capabilities change. Companies acquire other companies. I do not try to stay current on those. There's my colleague, you see at the bottom of the slide here where it says C-level partners. My co-author, Candace Hokinson, worked for a company called C-level. The name of the company now is Argon Digital, okay? Argon, like the chemical element, argondigital.com. If you go to argondigital.com or C-level.com, if their old website is still there, they have a very nice report which compares a lot of requirements management tools. So that would be a useful resource. And if you can't find that report, send me an email and I'll tell you where to find it. But I don't try to stay current on the tools. They just change too fast.
Yeah, we will definitely talk to you about this later and distribute links to our community. Okay, and the next question, what do you think about the trend of business architecture analysis?
Well, I don't know exactly what that means. This is one problem we have with the BA world, is that there are all of these subdomains. There's business analysis, business systems analysis, data analysis. There are data architects, there are business architects, there's what you just said. And I don't think those all mean the same thing to everybody. I don't know that there are standard definitions for those. And so someone who's called, say, an architecture analyst in one company, that might be called something different in another company. In general, I am in favor of analysis and in favor of having people who think carefully about what they're doing and get review input from other people and tie it to other parts of the work being done. But I don't know exactly what that particular role is. See, the luxury of being retired is that I don't have to stay on top of all of those things.
Well, on the other hand, you can consolidate and perfect knowledge.
That too.
So thank you for that. Thank you from all of us. Couple of questions about work-related situations. You have a team and they ask you for highly precise acceptance criteria that go far beyond the overall goal or limits, and every single small detail needs to be mentioned. What to do and how to explain the team where the balance is?
I guess I'm trying to understand why that is a problem. Don't you want to have fairly precise acceptance criteria, say on making sure a user story is working exactly as it's supposed to?
Well, sometimes those requests are about overly precise and overly detailed acceptance criteria. And if we will go through the trot, we will never be able to complete on time or within any market required deadlines.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess one way that you can approach that is to figure out, instead of saying, instead of looking at it as how much detail do we need, It's more a question of how much detail can we get away with? Okay. And so you say, well, what would be an unacceptable criteria? Instead of saying, what are all your acceptance criteria? What would be rejection criteria? What would make you say, this has not been satisfied? This is not good enough. This is not precise enough. And that way you don't have to itemize every single positive. Instead, you can identify the negatives and use that as a guideline. Sometimes that's a way to shift people's thinking.
Thank you. About your personal practice, what's the most challenging situation you experienced as business analyst and what you learned from that?
That's an interesting question. My most challenging situation. Well, one of the projects from which I learned a lot was when I was working at Kodak many years ago. There was a project that for a system that had to be developed. This was the chemical tracking system. And the reason this had to be developed was for the Kodak research labs. I'm a chemist by background. It had to be developed because we had a health and safety person in the research laboratories who had to generate reports required by the government to let them know how chemicals were brought into the company, stored, handled, used, and safely disposed of. And he had to generate these reports. There was a lot of pressure on him. So this system had to be built. I got called in as a BA, essentially as a consulting BA, but I did about half of the BA work because the project had been attempted 2 times before and had failed to produce anything. And this guy was getting desperate. He needed this system. And so the challenging part was I went and I met him and I didn't know him before. And I said, okay, we'd like to talk to you about your requirements for this system, right? Good place to start. And he said, I gave your predecessors on the 2 previous projects all my requirements. I don't have time to talk about requirements anymore. Build me a system. That became our mantra, build me a system. So I had this very unhappy, hostile, most important customer for the whole project who was very frustrated because of these 2 previous attempts. I never found out exactly why they failed, but these teams came in, talked to him about requirements, did not write anything down, was what I was told, and then they went away, and that was that. So I said, okay, look, we have, first of all, I will promise you that anything we learn about requirements, we will write down. Second, we have some techniques we've learned, such as use cases, that we think are more effective for exploring requirements than what people have done before. And if you're willing, we'd like to work with you on those. That was one thing. He said, oh, okay. Also, we identified other user classes who were very important to the success of this project besides this one individual. And we engaged with them as well. And he was a little reluctant, but he said, okay, he went along with it. And there's a very nice outcome to this story. We did a good job on the requirements, I think. It was a very well executed BA experience, in my personal opinion. And I learned a great deal from that. That was one of the reasons that was useful, is I learned a lot about how to do these things. And I found out several years later that the requirements that we wrote were actually outsourced to another company for implementation. And when I was teaching a class someplace, there was a man in the class who had worked at that other company and he knew the project. He said the requirements were very good. We built a system without much trouble and it was used for about 12 years. Very successful project. But that was very challenging because I had to start with this history of a very unhappy customer with failed projects and figure out what was wrong with those and what do we do differently to make it succeed. And I was very pleased that we did.
Thank you. That was a great story.
Long answer, but an interesting story.
So if you have stakeholder resistance or skepticism towards value of business analysis, how would you demonstrate the importance?
To demonstrate the importance of business analysis, well, if the customer's hostile, I think we first have to understand why. Why do they have this attitude that, well, no, we don't need no requirements or something like that? Or I can just tell you what you need to do, don't need any business analyst. Well, let's understand what their thinking is first. Seek to understand first, and then we can try to educate them if we need to. But one thing we can do, just like this one customer I was describing, he had previous bad experiences and he didn't really want to go through that again. So once I understood that, we could figure out how to tell him, look, we're going to do something different, and I don't think you'll have the same problem. Another thing you can do is you can point to previous bad experiences that the person who's resisting may not be aware of why those were difficult experiences. But I didn't say that very well. Look for pain, okay? Look for points of pain that people have experienced that you can trace back to problems with how requirements were handled, such as insufficient business analysis or poor communication, or we didn't write anything down, that sort of thing. And if you can identify the pain and tie that back to poor business analysis or the lack of business analysis, then I think you can build a better case that says, yes, but if we do these things that we know work, we won't have that kind of pain again. Pain is a great motivator for change, don't you think?
Yeah, I actually often face with situations where there is more ignorance than pain.
Yes.
And
yes, very good.
Customers and stakeholders just come to you and say, we need no testing, we need no planning, we need no business analysis, we need no of those auxiliary activities. Just build me an iPhone application and that's it.
Just call me when you're done, right?
Yeah.
It's funny you should say that. I was at a conference many years ago, and I just happened to have lunch at a table with a man who was another speaker there. I was speaking too. I didn't know him. I knew who he was. He was a well-known speaker and author in C++ programming. And so he asked me what I did, and I told him, project management and requirements. He said, "Oh, the theoretical stuff." No, it's not theoretical. It's very fundamental to success, but that was his attitude. So yes, people often don't appreciate the value that's added by people who do this kind of work and do those, non-essential things.
Yeah. Let's go to the next question. When you're dealing with multiple stakeholders with different needs from different departments, with different responsibilities and, even value within the organization, how do you navigate in this environment? What strategies do you use to prioritize?
Well, that's a very good question. One of the things that we need to do as part of stakeholder analysis, and particularly in user analysis, users are just a subset of stakeholders, is that we group our users into user classes. Sometimes people talk about the user as though there's only one kind of user for your product, but that's not the case. There are almost always numerous, sometimes many, classes of users who have different characteristics or different needs. And some of those users are going to have more weight in the decision-making process than others. Some of them have interests that are more strongly aligned with our business objectives. Those are favored user classes. There are also disfavored user classes who you say, you don't get what you asked for. And then there are people who simply get what they get, okay, just ordinary user classes. So there's this range of user classes and stakeholders, some of whom have very, very strong influence because satisfying them is strongly aligned with achieving our business objectives. Others are less important, whether you're talking about a commercial product and a sales, a market segment, or whether you're talking about a company product. And there are certain people who have to be satisfied, like that one core customer I was talking about. They have to be satisfied because that was the main objective for building the chemical tracking system. And to the extent possible, we will satisfy other people as well. But if we get conflicting requirements, he wins because it's more important to do what he needs to achieve his
Mhm.
objectives than what somebody else might want. So you need to have that analysis before you encounter those conflicts, because then you have a more logical, rational way to make those decisions. And it's not just a matter of opinion or the last person who spoke to you or the loudest voice you heard.
Yeah, and you certainly don't need to show your stakeholders your matrix of weight of all their opinions and timings.
Oh, you're
and
not
their
important.
positions. Yeah,
Right.
just
Yes.
consider everyone important and then do the best for your job.
Right. And we also need, that's why we also need to know who are our decision makers for those kinds of things. And what is the basis by which they will make decision? What is their decision rule? Because if I think I'm responsible for making a priority trade-off decision, and I do, and someone else can come in and say, well, that's wrong, we have to do it this other way. Well, who's really making the decision? Let's understand that before we start having those fights.
Okay, we asked quite a few questions and we actually have a lot more. How much time do you have?
I have a few more minutes.
Okay, then let's continue. Let's say we have two different situations when your project is ongoing and when it's already done and in support mode. How do you think business analysis role will differ in those two different situations?
So if you're in the support mode, then presumably we are adding enhancements or updating our application because of changing business rules and things like that. Well, you do a lot of the same things. It's the main difference is that when you're working on an existing product, you have many, many more constraints. You have interfaces that are already defined that you have to respect. You have policies that are being enforced, like you might have, stored procedures for data to make sure that we're, following all of our data validations and things. So I think the main thing is that you have to understand the constraints within which you work. You also have to then look at effects between, not just on the local solution or application or product that you're working on, but if I make a change here, what is that connected to? Because we often have integrations in our corporate environments or even in commercial products where, again, through the interfaces, what you change or add to one application has to be consistent with others. It has an impact on others. And you see this actually in, even like in the iPhone, in the Apple iPhone, I see many different ways to delete an object, whether it's a text message or an email or a note or a reminder or whatever. There are many different ways that you do that. Do you hold it down until an option appears? Do you swipe left? Is it red for delete or not? Do you use the trash can icon? There are many different conventions, and that suggests to me that as people added all these new capabilities, they didn't necessarily think about everything that was integrated together and doing it so it presents a consistent user experience. It increases the user's learning curve and their error rate. So I think that's the main thing you have to consider when you're working with existing products is you don't have a clean sheet of paper to work on. You have a lot of constraints, an ecosystem you have to work within to both be consistent for user experience and to respect the established data tables and data values and interfaces and technologies that are all used.
Okay, and now let's talk about discovery phase. Before the project will be in the continuous mode, right? What are the essential practices and techniques for this stage, and which may be considered extra or redundant?
Well, that's not a short conversation, and it depends on the situation. Unfortunately, the correct answer to many of these kinds of questions is it depends. It depends on the particular situation and the specifics. And so I don't like to give very specific recommendations for situations that could turn out to be a terrible suggestion just because I don't know enough about it. But in the discovery phase, I think one of the things you need to do is not get into too much detail too early. Okay. But, I'm not very comfortable trying to give a concise answer to that particular question. I think all of the practices we talked about today could apply when thoughtfully considered to any of the situations, any of the scenarios we're talking about. What we need to do is go through a list of these practices. Here's my suggestion. If you're in a particular situation and you're facing that question of, which ones of these things should I do? Which ones are optional? You can probably judge that. Go through the list of 20 practices or through a longer list in a bigger book and ask yourself, if I do this, how much value would it provide to my problem situation? How helpful would it be? How much risk would it reduce? Another way to ask it is, if I don't do this, how much trouble could I get into? Should I skip stakeholder analysis? Should I skip decision making? Should I skip, event analysis? You might say, well, yes, I can skip event analysis because the nature of this project and product we're talking about, that's not really event driven, it's interaction driven. Okay, maybe event analysis isn't too useful for you. But if you ask yourself going through that list, I think you'll probably be able to figure out in almost every situation, these are things I really ought to do. These are things that maybe aren't so important right now.
So basically rank them yourself.
Yes.
Okay, and next question is
maybe one more question if you have.
Okay, this is good for the last question. It's tricky and fun. How to cover all possible scenarios?
How to cover all possible scenarios? Well, I don't know of any way to be certain that you have not missed a requirement. I don't know of any way to be sure your specification, whatever it is complete. And that's because the missing requirements aren't there. They're invisible, so you don't see them. So I think we need to ask a lot of questions to avoid missing something important. And that's where a good BA can add a lot of value. You might discuss a scenario, which is the normal, the default, the most commonly used scenario, what we call the happy path or the normal flow. Sure, we'll talk about that. But then you might ask questions like, is there any other way somebody would do this? Or is there any situation in which they wouldn't have this piece of information, but they still need to accomplish that task? So I think the BA needs to be creative to look at those kinds of possibilities. And someone might say, no, that would never happen. That's just not permitted. Or they might say, oh, yeah, sometimes I think about it this way. I hadn't mentioned that before. And then also look for the exceptions. What could go wrong? How could this fail? And is there a way to recover from it? Or are we just dead? In which case, what happens after that? So I think the BA has a lot of responsibility to ask those kinds of questions to try to pull out that discussion and discover those other alternative scenarios that people probably aren't going to think to mention. You're not going to talk to every potential user who's thinking of every potential way they might use it. So you need to probe, to explore. You still aren't going to know if you got them all, but you'll probably get more of them.
Okay, this concludes our Q&A session. Thank you, Karl. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for great presentation. Thank you for all of your thoughtful answers. And thank you for helping Ukraine.
I'm very happy to do so, and I wish you all the best. I think of you often.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Bye-bye, everybody.